Welcome to the Saturday Morning Breakfast Mix, where we highlight the highs and lows of a particular Saturday morning cartoon and maybe some weekday ones that I, as well as many of us, grew up with, and to show why these awesome Saturday morning cartoons made weekends and weekdays just the best, and why seeing them now instantly brings back glorious memories of those carefree childhood days. Sometimes the most extraordinary things have the most ordinary beginnings. For example, Peter Parker, a normal high school student who was loved dearly by the only two people in his life, his aunt and uncle. But while he excelled at science, those accomplishments were often overshadowed by his shyness. But a strange accident in an ordinary laboratory suddenly changed it all. An accident that brought about monumental change that no one could ever have thought. Strange and amazing gifts were a result of the accident, but in selfish pride, the boy chose to use those gifts in the hopes of instant wealth and fame. His attempts in exploiting these gifts resulted in his uncle paying the ultimate price, his life. It is because of what he was told long ago by that very man that raised him that the boy chooses to use his gifts for good. A champion of justice that is defined by these simple words: with great power comes great responsibility. This is his story.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big hang-up. Wherever there's a hang-up, you'll find a Spider-Man.
Spider-Man is a Canadian-American animated television series in the superhero genre. It was the first animated adaptation of the Spider-Man comic book series that first appeared in Amazing Fantasy 15th, August 1962, and later continued in his own series with the Amazing Spider-Man 1 on March of 1963. The character was created by writer Stan Lee and artist Steve Ditko, and the cartoon was jointly produced in Canada and the United States, with the voice acting being handled in Canada and the animation being handled in the United States. The first two seasons aired on the ABC television network, and the third was distributed in syndication. Grant Trey Lawrence Animation produced the first season, and seasons 2 and 3 were produced by Krantz Films in New York City. The show stars Paul Soles, a voice actor who was first to portray the titular hero for the series in its entire run, and also portray other Marvel characters like Bruce Banner, Hawkeye, Happy Hogan, and others on the 1966 animated The Marvel Superheroes program. But it was his work on Spider-Man cartoon series that everyone would most know him from. Spider-Man was initially broadcasted in the US on Saturday mornings on ABC. The first episode that aired was The Power of Dr. Octopus and Sub-Zero for Spidey on Saturday, September 9th of 1967. For the majority of the first two seasons, the show was originally aired around 10 in the morning. ABC's last Saturday morning broadcast of Spider-Man was on August 30th, 1969, with 39 half-hour episodes, mainly with two separate stories already aired on television. After that, the show went on hiatus until the following March, when a third season began a 6-month run, from March 22nd to September 6, 1970, on Sunday mornings around 10:30 in the morning. The cartoon features the adventures of Marvel's most famous character and has proven to be the most famous, as well as the final production by Grant Trey Lawrence Animation in Toronto, Ontario. The 2 seasons of the show were originally commissioned by ABC. Although previous animated Marvel ventures were little more than basic animation of static images, ABC invested a lot of money into this series with the idea that this would be similar in the style to Johnny Quest in terms of limited animation. This proved to be too much to cope with, as after making just 1 season, Grant Trey Lawrence Animation filed for bankruptcy. Krantz Films, the company who at the time was acting as distributor, fulfilled the rest of the contract by taking on the animation of the 2nd season themselves as cheaply as possible, using as many of the assets from their own animated show, Rocket Robin Hood, as possible. A 3rd season was then commissioned to bring the number of the episodes up to the syndication standard of 52 episodes and get some of the lost money back from rerun packages. The series revolved around teenage Peter Parker, a college student who develops extraordinary strength and spider-like powers after being bitten by a radioactive spider. After the death of his beloved uncle, Ben Parker, Peter decides to become a crime-fighting costume superhero but must deal with the family tragedies, personal problems, and the insecurity of youth. As Spider-Man, Parker risks his life to fight superpowered criminals such as Dr. Octopus, Mysterio, and the Green Goblin. Peter works as a freelance photographer for the Daily Bugle, but editor J. Jonah Jameson considers Spider-Man a criminal and writes front-page headlines being critical of his activities by making Spider-Man look to the public as a threat more than a hero to the people of New York. The 1st season dealt primarily with Peter's job at Daily Bugle, focusing on his relationship with Jameson, his romance with receptionist Betty Brant, and often being called into action as his alter ego. Peter's life, apart from the Bugle office and his Aunt May's Forest Hills home, was barely dealt with in early episodes. Although he was never seen at college, he would sometimes visit professors he knew. Peter's characteristics and look was designed by Steve Ditko and art consultant John Romita Sr. Season 1 stories mainly involved classic Spider-Man villains from the comic book series, whose captures were often accompanied by a note signed, "Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man." Stan Lee was the story consultant for the 1st season. Grant Trey Lawrence Animation were originally the company responsible for the series in the 1st season, while were on the brink of bankruptcy by the time it premiered and had filed for it by the year's end, forcing them to hand over production duties to Krantz Films Inc., known at the time for shows like Rocket Robin Hood and for being the then home of Ralph Bakshi, who became the show's lead animator. Under Krantz's watch, budgets were slashed by more than half, and the show took a very different tone, reintroducing Peter as the geeky, ordinary high school student he was when he first appeared in the now famous issue of Amazing Fantasy. Minus the glasses, of course. In fact, the 1st episode of the 2nd season was a retelling of Spidey's origin story, complete with the refusal to stopping a runaway thief because of his own selfish pride, resulting in the death of his Uncle Ben. It is within that very episode that Peter decides to take justice into his own hands and find the burglar that killed his uncle to extract revenge. It is when Peter confronts his uncle's killer and defeats him that a shocking revelation occurs. That the man that had killed his uncle was the same man he refused to apprehend earlier in the television studio. After realizing this, Peter feels a sense of guilt, for he blames himself for the death of his uncle and as a result realizes something that has become the crux of why Spider-Man does what he does, that with great power comes great responsibility. It is with that line that Peter chooses to use his powers to help others, and as the episode ends, we are reminded of that last panel from the original comic book that is spoken by the narrator, which says,
"Thus, a legend is born, as a new name is added to the roster of those who make the world of fantasy the most exciting realm of all."
Bakshi explored Peter's everyday life as a soft-spoken college student and was responsible for providing the first origin story for Spider-Man presented on television, the origin of Spider-Man, which used chunks of Stan Lee's dialogue from the original comic. You would think with that type of episode that the series was going to be in good hands with Krantz Film, but I'm afraid we were all wrong. The classic comic book rogues gallery was thrown out because of licensing costs and were replaced by generic villains and henchmen. More often than not, the cost cutting is most apparent in the third season, with 2 episodes reusing almost all of the footage from the 2 Rocket Robin Hood episodes. Notably, the Season 3 Rocket Robin Hood episodes Dementia 5 and From Menace to Menace, with Spider-Man substituted for Robin Hood in the animation cells for the episodes in his series Phantom of the Depths of Time and The Revolt in the Fifth Dimension. This was hugely obvious to those who watched both of the cartoons, as the reuse of dialogue, characters, and names was pretty hard to ignore. Everything was reused down to even the most trippiest scenes ever put on a children's television show at the time. Well, this was the late 60s, early 70s after all. Another case of reusing footage for the cartoon comes from the form of Spider-Man swinging across the New York City skyline, with the web swinging being reused more than once in one scene per episode. While we're on that, because of the series' limited budget, Spider-Man's costume only has webbed areas on his head, arms, and boots. The rest is pretty plain, except for the spiders on his chest and back. The second and third season episodes also had a darker tone with dark-colored settings, psychedelic images, and atmospheric music. In particular, the theme song of the show has become a popular standard. The lyrics were written by Academy Award winner Paul Francis Webster, while the music was composed by Bob Harris. This catchy theme got everyone who watched hooked and imprinted itself on a generation of viewers that even to this day is often sung or mentioned when talking about anything Spider-Man related. Oh, did you know? In the opening title sequence of the show, Spider-Man is shown looking out a window at a jewelry store. The store sign clearly displays the wrong spelling for jewelry, and it's only when Spider-Man swings down and kicks the door open that the spelling for the store is written correctly. Also throughout the series, the spider emblem on Spider-Man's suit switches between having 6 legs to having the correct 8, noticeable from Season 2 onwards when the episodes start reusing more footage. Each episode from the first season more or less followed the same basic formula. Something weird happens somewhere in New York and we see the villain causing it, usually one of Spidey's classic comic book rogues gallery. J. Jonah Jameson, the Daily Bugle editor, replaced the information through lots of yelling and fist-pounding to Bugle employees Betty Brant and Peter Parker. Jameson orders Parker to get pictures. Peter somehow finds out who the attacker is and goes on the hunt for them as the web-slinging, wall-crawling hero, Spider-Man. Spidey manages to find the villain and defeat them, usually by leaving them all webbed up and with a note that always ended with your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Once that is over, Peter, Miss Brant, and Jameson are usually seen discussing the aftermath and share a laugh before the episode ends. Usually each episode consisted of 2 15-minute segments, though more than once there was one full-length half-hour segment. Sure, there are flaws that really stand out. Seriously, even with everything mentioned, this series is still great fun nevertheless. Even after all these years, it's still a shining gem in the world of animation and Spider-Man fans alike. I grew up on this cartoon. To some, including myself, this was the very first time Spider-Man had ever been made into a cartoon, and so the idea of actually getting to see him swinging from building to building outside of the constrictions of a comic book was something of a big deal. This cartoon introduced Marvel Comics founder Stan Lee's remarkable hero to a whole new audience. This series cannot be easily forgotten or removed from popular culture. However odd this cartoon may have been, it is still quite popular and there are many fans who still enjoy it for a variety of reasons. It has a charm that many still remember and cherish to this day. The theme song itself fills the audience with joy and anticipation for what's to come in each episode, something that cartoons of these days don't really have. It's an amazing experience to watch, flaws and all. This is an amazing series that for many had introduced us to the world of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Give it a chance and you might be surprised on how enjoyable the show really is. A memorable show for one of comics' most iconic and beloved characters. Every generation has their favorite Spider-Man television show, and that's something only a few cartoons can admit. Thank you so much, and remember when it comes to cartoons we grew up with, that to truly appreciate something, you have to accept its strengths and its faults, no matter what they are, because when that happens you can appreciate how amazing it was and how amazing it continues to be. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all next time.
Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Look out, here comes Spider-Man. Look out! Let's go! In the chill of the night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Well, the plan is ignored, action is his reward to him. Life is a great big bang up, whenever there's a hang-up, you'll find Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big bang up. Wherever there's a hang up, you'll find the Spider-Man.